Indigenous women make up almost half the female prison population, ombudsman says.
Here's a summary of the article.
The indigenous inmate population has increased roughly 18% over the past decade, while the number of non-indigenous inmates has dropped by 28% in the same period, says Zinga's report. While the percentage of non-indigenous offenders has dropped, Zinga said, there hasn't been a corresponding drop among indigenous inmates because they are more likely to serve longer portions of their sentence and are less likely to be granted parole or conditional release. In an emailed statement, the Correctional Service of Canada said it shares Zinga's concern and pointed to a number of initiatives it's undertaking, such as healing lodges that offer culturally appropriate services to Indigenous offenders. We are making progress but recognize there is more work to do. CSC will continue to work with its criminal justice partners and Indigenous communities to support the rehabilitation of Indigenous offenders, the statement says. The inquiry's final report offered 13 recommendations to address over-incarceration of Indigenous women, including calls for more Indigenous-run and culturally appropriate rehabilitation programs. Pate said the government needs to go further and allow judges more discretion on mandatory minimum sentences in cases involving Indigenous offenders. Sunchild said the government needs to put more emphasis on so-called GLADU reports, pre-sentencing and bail hearing reports that inform judges of the backgrounds of Indigenous offenders, including instances of trauma.
This post received a score of 3,000, with an upvote ratio of 94%. Here are the top comments in response to this article.
Well, yeah, the mental health, drug, alcohol abuse, poverty and domestic abuse is rampant among Indigenous communities in Canada, and surely in other countries. Those communities and how they are managed externally, at the federal level, and internally, at the chief council level, need a major overhaul. Edit, to be clear, we can't ignore the effects of colonization and the shitty conditions, the genocide, the mass killing of children, and shitty history in general. I'm not blaming Indigenous people for anything, we need to work together to solve this. We need an open dialogue.
In some European countries, the indigenous population is upwards of 90% of the prison population.
For all the European countries, are the majority of the populations not the indigenous people?
Men make up 94% of Canada's prison population.
Are women even trying?
Pierre Trudeau proposed some 50 years ago that the Indian Act be repealed and Canada's Indigenous trade their status as a parallel society for compensation, and just become Canadians, no more no less. I think that would have been a terrific idea because the special status has delivered in far too many cases only poverty and misery to the Indigenous.
Status ain't the issue, it's the geographical location of the majority of reserves. It was literally out of sight out of mind mentality and the reason why the majority of reserves are isolated communities. This means that the majority of reserves are just residential districts with nothing else there. This leads to a repeating cycle of boredom, abuse and poverty, with the majority of people stuck in this cycle unable to escape it.
Indigenous people have better social outcomes when they don't live segregated on reservations, at least in the US, from the study I read. I know, assimilation is a dirty word now, but it's likely the only realistic way out of these disparities.
But Indigenous people in countries where there are no reservations are still a massive part of prison stats, poverty, etc. Just look at New Zealand. They never had reservations and they still have all the same problems the other colonized countries have. Prison pop, massive wealth gap, and bad health outcomes for Indigenous.
New Zealand doesn't have reservations specifically, but they still have the same basic issue where the settlers systematically swindled or stole all the best land and pushed the natives out their originally productive territories.
They also had massive assimilation. Result: about 1 in 6 New Zealanders is Indigenous. Maori in New Zealand don't live separately. They live in the same towns and cities as everyone else. But the legacy of dispossession means they still have very little wealth and all these terrible outcomes.
This video was automatically created by Reddit to speech. The article and comments in this video were selected from Reddit according to their upvotes, and any paraphrasing was performed by smmry.com, without any human intervention.